The Hudson Valley UFO sightings were not what people think they were. Today I'm diving into Night Siege, co-authored by UFO debunker turned true believer, J. Allen Hynek. This was a wave of extraordinary sightings that spanned the early 1980s through the mid-90s, even after Hynek's death. Probably the most prolific sightings in terms of number of sightings and number of witnesses in the history of the UFO phenomenon. There was a rough split in the nature of the events from the early 80s and then from the mid-80s through the mid-90s. The early 80s tended to be lights and large craft that people witnessed. From the mid-80s to the mid-90s, the tenor of some of the sightings changed. There were many more instances of what people called high strangeness. First, telepathy, hearing voices or feeling they were in psychic communication with entities inside these craft that they were observing. Second, people witnessing entities, whether human or non-human, outside or inside these craft. And third, numerous abduction experiences. The high strangeness element of the Hudson Valley Wave is rarely talked about. I think the mainstream wishes it didn't exist. They wish it away. I've often talked about ontological shock. With respect to the Hudson Valley Wave, people underwent some form of ontological shock, whether it was just the experience of seeing something otherworldly, whether it was some form of psychic communication with entities in these ships that they were observing, or whether it was in more traumatic circumstances, being abducted. It's worth pointing out that for some people, these were multiple events. Again, this was a wave that spanned more than a decade in the same region of upstate New York and parts of Connecticut, what's known as the tri-state area outside of New York City. And so people, in some cases, had multiple experiences. Perhaps closer than any other UFO wave and experiences of which I'm aware, the Hudson Valley Wave most closely resembled what people think of with respect to close encounters of the third kind. People had very almost cinematic, communal sightings and experiences where many people, the sun had just gone down, they see these massive airships above the highway in Westchester County, for example, and they're parking their car on the highway, getting out, standing shoulder to shoulder with total strangers, in awe, fascinated, scared, confused, pointing up at the sky directly above them, sharing in this collective revelatory experience. For some reason, people talk about the Phoenix Lights, they talk about Area 51, they talk about these other locations and sighting events. They don't really talk about the Hudson Valley UFO Wave as a big, profound event or series of events. I don't know why that's the case. This is the story of Night Siege and the Hudson Valley UFO Wave. I'm Tim Stone. I'm a lawyer in New York. Began my career as a prosecutor. I'm also an author. I've written a couple of science fiction thrillers about the mysterious, the unexplained, the hidden reality, hiding in plain sight. And now I talk about the paranormal, the esoteric, conspiracy theories as I walk around the Catskill Mountains. Quick request, the YouTube economy, I don't think people really understand this. It runs on audience clicking like and subscribe. It's free. It takes about 2.1 seconds to do it, and it's incredibly helpful to content creators. I'd really appreciate it if you consider clicking those buttons. We've got a lot to cover with respect to Night Siege and the Hudson Valley Wave, so I've divided this into 3 parts. The first part is, think of it like a survey course into the Hudson Valley Wave through Night Siege. I'm going to explore the elements at a high level and at a pattern or macro level of the Hudson Valley Wave that distinguishes this series of events from other UFO encounters. This includes some really invaluable data and analytics that the authors of Night Siege compiled as they investigated the Hudson Valley Wave over the course of a decade and included in the book Episode 2 will focus on witness accounts presented in Night Siege. I'm going to start with ones that attest to the size, shape, colors, speed, sound, and behavior of these craft. Through those accounts, I want to focus on the extraordinary nature of those craft without diving too deeply into the high strangeness. In that part, I'm also going to dig into the events at Indian Point. It's a nuclear power plant in upstate New York where there was an astonishing UFO encounter where this gigantic ship shut down various systems and operations of the nuclear power facility there. The final part will dive into the high strangeness, the telepathy, people hearing voices in their heads as they're looking at these massive otherworldly craft, their observations of entities in and around these craft, and then people who had abductions, who reported memories of abductions. A few things separate the Hudson Valley Wave from other UFO sightings. One is just the sheer number of occurrences and witnesses. And it's hard to state with precision exactly how many witnesses there were and how many experiences people had. That's because first, this lasted for more than a decade, from the early 80s to the mid-1990s, and likely beyond. Mid-1990s was simply when Night Siege was published. Second, this happened in the skies of one of the most densely populated areas in the world, in northeastern United States, clustered around New York City. It's densely populated and cosmopolitan. It also has one of the most highly educated populations of anywhere in the world. Estimating the numbers gets easier because the authors built a data set and did some preliminary analytics from that data set based on the cases that they recorded from witnesses. That data set went into the thousands. Those analytics, just analysis of data, pick into what was seen at scale, what was heard, when these events happened, when the sightings happened, and other metrics. This data set includes 7,046 discrete cases. That's a considerable number of cases to document as part of one wave in one concentrated region. Probably not even a region, it's just a small area, more or less, north of New York City. The authors and their team really deserve a lot of credit for not only writing the book, stringing together really interesting, compelling vignettes, people telling their stories about what they experienced, but also building this data set for posterity's sake, for the sake of future researchers, and for the sake of humanity to look back on these events and interpret them, figure out what they mean. This data is a goldmine for researchers, historians, and for humanity looking back on these profound interactions, observations of and interactions with what I believe was a non-human intelligence, or intelligences, over a sustained period of time in a concentrated geographic area just north of New York City. I said it in the context of disclosure and, for example, Gordon Cooper's experiences when I was lamenting how, especially for encounters with military personnel, these UFO events are memory hold. They're dismissed, disregarded, they're not studied. They don't receive the attention they should, because these are spectacular historic events when one species is interacting with another species. And I realize the human side, at least the public, still really doesn't understand what's happening or why, but I think we will one day, and it's important to have this information documented. So praise should really go to the authors, which included, as I've mentioned, J. Allen Hynek. He was the scientific consultant on Project Blue Book, the US government's, specifically the Air Force's, public-facing UFO program to study UFOs before it was eventually disbanded. Another scientist is also a co-author, and then an investigative reporter is the third co-author. And I believe they had a fairly large team supporting them in this endeavor, building this data set and writing this book. So let's consider some of the analytics helpfully presented in Night Siege to get a macro view of the Hudson Valley Wave. First, ships, airships, UFOs of different shapes and sizes were seen. It's worth pointing out before going on that there are sightings of objects of different shapes and sizes recorded in different locations at the same time throughout the Hudson Valley Wave, indicating that there was more than one craft. How many crafts were there? We don't know. But at the very least, there were more than one operating at various points during the Hudson Valley Wave. So I'm going to stop and read from my notes to talk about some of the analytics. In terms of shapes, of the 7,046 reported cases that the authors of Night Siege compiled, 30% were reported as a triangle, 24.6% as a V shape, 33.6% as a boomerang, and just under 10% reported a disc. So overwhelmingly, people were seeing some kind of triangular shaped craft, whether it was curved or with straighter angles. In terms of size, 59.9% estimated the craft at about 100 feet in length. 24.9%, so just under 25%, estimated it at 300 feet. And 15.2% estimated it at greater than 300 feet. Now, for reference, a American football field is 300 feet if you remove the end zones. More than 7,000 recorded sightings. You think about it, more than 15% saw something that was bigger than a football field. About 25% saw something that was the size of a football field. And 60% saw something that was just larger than an NBA basketball court. If you think of an NBA basketball court, it's 94 feet. People estimated, 60% estimated that something was about 100 feet long. In terms of colors, the majority, 70.6%, again, of more than 7,000 reported sightings, saw multiple colors. Colors are an interesting feature of the Hudson Valley craft or crafts, and often in many UFO sightings, but in particular the Hudson Valley Wave, because in this case, many of the accounts describe how the lights, a single light, these craft had many lights on them, but a single light would change colors across the colors of the rainbow. So you have a light going from red to green to blue to white to yellow. And not only that, but that individual lights would move, and almost like they were on a platform, moving along the ship, rotating and pivoting. I wanted to determine if craft that have lights that can change color and also shift position, whether that's something that exists in human-made aircraft as we understand it. So I asked Claude, do we have craft with single lights that can not only move positions on the craft as if they're on some kind of rolling platform, but that can go from blue to green to purple to orange to red to white? And Claude answered, this is a really interesting question. And the short answer is no. No conventional human aircraft uses lighting that physically moves across the surface of the craft or changes through a full color spectrum. So if someone is observing lights that appear to physically migrate across a craft while cycling through multiple colors, that behavior has no conventional aviation explanation. It's one of the more specific and compelling categories of UAP witness descriptions, precisely because it doesn't map onto anything in the known aircraft lighting playbook. Moving on to sound, 55.1% of the more than 7,000 recorded sightings heard a humming. 42.8% didn't hear any sound, and 2.2% heard what they described as an engine. In terms of what people reported for the structure of this craft, or the lack of structure, 54.4% said they saw a dark metal shape. 34.9% reported seeing only lights and not seeing any structure. So you got more than half of witnesses who reported a case saying they actually saw the physical structure of this craft. As to speed of the witness reported sightings, more than 7,000 recorded by the authors of Night Siege, 72.3% described the speed of the craft as slow. 14.2% reported the craft as moving very fast. The rest just saw what they described as a normal speed. From a slightly larger data set that includes certain more recent cases, so 7,231 in total, 900 reports were described as involving contact. Now in this context, contact meant that the observer, the experiencer, felt he or she made some type of contact with a non-human intelligence. That's 900 reports involving some form of contact. That's not an insignificant number. That's quite spectacular when you think about it. And that's a significant percentage of reported sightings. We're talking about 900 out of 7,231 involved essentially extrasensory perception, some form of telepathy with a non-human intelligence, or whatever it is that we're inside and operating these craft. Of the 256 reports involving a non-human entity that was witnessed or interacted with, 40.2% reported that the entity was a reptile or a reptilian. 48.4%, so slightly more, said it was a short gray. 9.8% described a tall gray. And 1.6% described the entity as a human. In terms of when during the year these sightings occurred, or more than sightings, the peak months were March and July. It's well established that not many people actually report UFO sightings or their experiences with the paranormal. People keep that to themselves for all the reasons we've talked about on past episodes. The taboo that has been built and sustained around the UFO topic, that when you come forward and put forward your experience, that you're labeled a kook, that you're stigmatized, and it could adversely affect your job, your career, your personal life. Especially 30 years ago when the Hudson Valley Wave occurred, that stigma was even stronger. People had very little reason to come forward and report these sightings and other kinds of experiences. So it's safe to say that the numbers, the reported sightings compiled in Night Siege, understates the actual true quantity of UFO events and encounters. My point is simply that 7,046 or 7,200 something, that is almost undoubtedly a small fraction of the actual UFO sightings and experiences that occurred. So let's do some extrapolation about what the true numbers potentially were. Let's estimate that 15% of people who had an experience or a sighting actually reported it, and that report found its way into Night Siege. I think that's probably an aggressive estimate. I think the real number, I think it's probably even smaller. I think it's probably more like 5%. But let's assume, for the sake of argument, that the 7,046 or 7,200 represents 15% of the actual sightings that occurred. That would mean there were approximately 47,000, just under 50,000 encounters that occurred during this UFO wave in the Hudson Valley. This is pretty amazing. A significant percentage of reported sightings, of the more than 7,000, approximately 900 involved some type of contact with a non-human entity. Of those 900, 256 involved actual observation of an entity. How about if we extrapolate how many actual observations and interactions with a specific kind of non-human entity occurred during the Hudson Valley sightings? I mentioned that there were 256 reported experiences where people actually saw and were able to categorize what they saw, such as a reptilian creature or a small gray. So if you extrapolate out that number, that would equate to approximately 1,700 actual instances of people observing a specific type of non-human entity. And again, I think these estimates are understating the true numbers. I think probably many more people had experiences, sightings, and something even more extreme than they were willing to admit. Probably admit potentially to their loved ones, maybe to themselves, much less come forward to the authors of Night Siege and put their experience in a book. Another interesting aspect of the Hudson Valley Wave is the makeup, the educational backgrounds, the professional experience of the witnesses. These are the suburbs of one of the richest and most cosmopolitan cities on Earth. And especially in the early 80s and then by the mid 90s, the United States was at the peak of its geopolitical power, particularly after the Soviet Union fell. Geopolitically, the United States was unrivaled. So this is the wealthiest suburban area of the wealthiest, most powerful country on Earth, truly unrivaled at that point in history. So it's interesting to dig into who were some of these people, at least their occupations, their educational backgrounds. who are the people coming forward and reporting these sightings, because that adds credibility to the wave and to people's accounts. I wrote down some of these people's backgrounds, their identities in some cases, from the book, and I think it's worth recounting some of them. And just keep in mind that this is a very small subset of the total number of witnesses. These are, number one, only witnesses that came forward to the authors of Night Siege, and the authors of Night Siege only did write-ups for a tiny subset of that 7,000, because they could only write about so many people and describe their accounts, one small fraction of that 7,000. So it's a subset of a subset of a subset. So I'm going to read from my notes some of the ones I found the most fascinating. Numerous pilots, electrical engineers, construction engineers, and mechanical engineers, including a man who designed small aircraft. IBM has its corporate headquarters in Westchester. The witnesses included an IBM executive and an IBM program manager, numerous active and retired police officers from the NYPD and surrounding communities, including at least one local police chief from the affected areas that had these UFO experiences, a biomedical engineer who designs laser equipment, air traffic controllers, numerous ones, teachers, military personnel, including a retired Air Force colonel, the chief meteorologist for the National Weather Corporation, accountants, an advertising executive, a law professor at the school where I went to law school, St. John's University School of Law in Queens, a correctional officer, a physicist, the VP of a large New York City electronics firm, the entire staff of a radio station in suburban New York State Power Authority police officers, and more than a dozen security personnel for the Indian Point nuclear power plant. It's interesting that because this wave lasted for so long, the authors were themselves witnesses. They were investigators. They were responding in real time to the sightings and would go out on the road and, like in Twister, when you think of Bill Paxton and Helen Hunt chasing tornadoes, they were civilian UFO chasers during this wave because it went on for so long. And yes, they saw the UFOs themselves, and they include their accounts in the book. At one point, the authors organized a UFO conference in upstate New York. It was in the midst of the sightings. They didn't think many people would show up, and it turned out that way more people than they expected showed up. More than 1,500 people overwhelmed the small school auditorium that they reserved for this conference. And they claimed that at the time it was the largest conference about UFOs in history that had been at least recorded at that point in time. And it attracted press coverage from around the world. My impression, the author's impression as well, is that people just were ravenous to get answers, to understand what they had seen. And what did the government know about what they'd seen? What was this? Or what were these gigantic craft hovering silently over the suburbs and shooting off across the horizon in the blink of an eye, doing the impossible? As I mentioned, in the next part of this review of the Hudson Valley UFO Wave and the book Night Siege, co-authored by JL and Hynek, we're going to be going into first-hand witness accounts, starting with accounts attesting to the size, structure, speed, sound, the extraordinary attributes of these craft, and then in the final part, accounts involving high strangeness, whether it's telepathy, non-human entities, or abductions. See you next time on Catskill Liminal Walk.